Hi guys, I'm Steph and that's Lisa together with Jenny from PD Connect. We have Benjamin here today. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to intro you and then we'll let you get started. You can take the floor here. So Benjamin Stecher was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease at age 29 and has since become actively involved in disease research and advocacy. He is the founder of Tomorrow, where he has interviewed close to 80 experts in Parkinson's. He sits on several patient advisory boards and speaks and consults regularly at academic labs, as well as biotech and pharmaceutical companies, working to bring better therapies for people diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Thanks so much for being here, Benjamin.
Yeah, no, I just, I heard Ben speak a while years ago, and it was just so refreshing and fascinating to hear his point of view and the way he presents Parkinson's and the science. And it was just really like, wow, we need to hear this. So thanks, Ben, for being here with us. And I'm going to turn it over to you, or you already are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you both for having me. Thank you to the whole PD Connect team, and thank you all for joining me today. Yeah, I'm going to be rambling on, I guess, for the next hour or so, or more if anybody wants. But feel free. I don't know if there's a mechanism for anybody to interject and ask questions along the way. I'm more than happy to take questions at any point. So if anybody wants to just chime in. And before I begin, is everyone here more or less in the California, San Francisco Bay Area, or are people coming in from all over the place?
They're mainly muted. They can unmute themselves if they want to. We have kind of
Yeah,
a
we've
wide
got
spectrum
people
here. Yeah.
from California, but we have people from across the state and even somebody across the pond if they're here.
Yeah, Marjorie's here, international.
also.
So we've got she's in Manchester. Yeah.
Manchester.
Maybe,
Hi.
maybe
Hi, Lisa. And the East Coast, Philadelphia area.
So that's right. East Coast Joan is here as well. Excellent. Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe if anybody wants, in the chat window, just quickly write down where you're from. It's always nice to know where in the world everyone is. Otherwise, I'm going to assume, I guess, the San Francisco Bay Area is where most of the people are going to be coming in from. But anyways, so I'm here to talk to you about what Parkinson's is and where I think we should be going forward. And it's a big question, obviously. And honestly, right off the bat, it's not one I'm completely qualified to answer. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist in any way. I'm just a kind of curious kid who went out and tried to look for answers about what was happening to myself along the way. But I'm going to show you a quick presentation, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions afterwards. So let's begin. Hey, that's not where I want to start. Okay, so let's begin. Curing neurodegenerative diseases. So I'll start by starting every story with where I'm from. I was born in this place, Nairobi, Kenya. Here I am as a baby, and here are my parents and my younger brother as well. Now we were in a unique position. We were able to pick and choose at that point where we wanted to live. I was 2 years old when we moved to Canada, Toronto, where I grew up. And I found myself very fortunate that my parents made that decision when I was so young, because it opened up the whole world to me. And I've always been a very avid traveler. It's something that I've always loved to do. And I took full advantage of that. I spent my entire 20s basically traveling to all these places. These are all the places that I lived for more than a month, more or less in my 20s. So I spent my time roaming about the world, but I was living and working primarily in China. I was helping run an education consulting company out there when I started to realize that something was wrong. I first noticed something when I was about 25 or 26 years old. I looked down at my right foot after a long day of hiking, and I realized that there was a tremor happening. But it went away, and I didn't think too much about it at the time. But looking back, that was the first sign that something was wrong. Now, to kind of give a quick summary of the end of this talk, where we're going and what I hope the future that we're building towards is one where at that age, at 26 years old, where I first see that I have a tremor, I would then go to a doctor's office. They would do some diagnostic tests on me to find out what specifically is going wrong and not just throw this label called Parkinson's at me, but actually be able to tell me, here's what's going wrong inside your brain, and here's some medications or some therapies or some things you can start doing about it. But we're a long way from that, unfortunately. We have the long road to go before we can actually get to that point where we can tailor a specific therapeutic regimen to a person's specific disease or whatever's going wrong with them. And until then, the best we have are people like the PD Connect team here who offer the kind of classes that they offer, because in many ways, those things are the best therapies we have at the moment, and they will be for the foreseeable future for most people, unfortunately. And I'll get into all the reasons why. But my diagnosis came when I was 29 years old. And when I looked around the internet, I saw pictures like this. This is what I saw when I searched for Parkinson's disease. Now, I don't know what anybody else here thinks, but I don't think I bear much resemblance to this old man over here. And so I went looking for other ways that I could try to understand this disease. My only reference points at the time were Michael J. Fox and Muhammad Ali. I didn't know anything else about this disease. So I actually went back and looked at Muhammad Ali lighting the Olympic torch in Atlanta in 1996. And this is what I saw. Now, a lot of people would look at this moment as kind of a brave man, not letting Parkinson's get to him. But what I saw is kind of the future that I was doomed to live. I mean, he's obviously struggling there. He's probably on a lot of medication just to make this appearance. This was kind of a troubling sign to me that I was in, pardon my French, I was in deep shit. So I realized I needed to educate myself. I realized at that point that I needed to get ahead of what was happening to me, and I needed to understand better for myself what was going on in this disease. So at 32, I left my career behind in China, and I pursued this kind of full time. I started to go from one research lab to another, just asking questions. At the beginning, I would send about 10 emails for every one email that I got back. It took a lot of, I was kind of very stubborn about it. I was just trying to wrap my head around what was going on, and also learn some of the emerging therapies in the pipeline to see what was coming down the road. Each of these pins represents a different lab that I visited along the way. So I got kind of the world tour of Parkinson's research and really tried to get as wide a breadth of understanding about what was going on in laboratories and pharmaceutical labs and biotech companies all around the world, just trying to get a handle on what was happening to me and what therapies were coming down the pipeline. This filled me with both hope and despair, and I'll go into reasons why. Hope, because there's a lot of activity happening. There's so many different drugs in development. There's over, if you add them all up on this list, there's something like 144, I think, different therapies in development for Parkinson's disease. Most of them are symptomatic therapies, but a few are also disease-modifying therapies. And also, that's what we really want, is those disease-modifying therapies. We want something to slow down the progression of this disease. To date, other than exercise and healthy lifestyle, we have nothing that no doctor can prescribe anything that will slow down the progression of this disease. And there's a lot of reasons for that I'll get into, but it fills me both with hope and with kind of despair because of how long it takes to actually get a drug through the clinical trial pipeline. It's basically a 20-year process. This is actually it's even worse than what this timeline indicates. It's a long, difficult road to actually get a drug approved for Parkinson's disease. And I've come to I sit on now a bunch of advisory panels. I talk to pharma representatives pretty regularly. I've gotten a good sense, I think, of why this takes so long, what the bottlenecks are, and what we need to do going forward to try to speed things up. But this is the reality that we face today. It's a long road to building a drug that can try to do something about the actual course of this disease. Meanwhile, our clocks are ticking. This is very much a race against time. Every month that goes by, every year that goes by, things become a little bit more difficult and a little bit more difficult. For me, this is the best description of what my Parkinson's disease looks like. I usually give this talk often to scientists and researchers, and you'll be amazed how little some of them know about the disease itself. So I have to show them charts like this so they get a better sense of what the disease actually kind of feels like. And to me, this is just the best depiction of what it feels like to me, these kind of fluctuating on-off periods throughout the day and throughout the life cycle of this disease. But I've also come to realize that this can't be applied to everybody. And this is something that I'll be talking about again and again and again, is that this term that we call Parkinson's disease is really a grab bag term. I mean, something I struggle with often is how useful this word really is. How useful is it that we have this word called Parkinson's disease? And there's a lot that can be said about it. It does a lot of good for one. I mean, it connects people together. We have this community of people that have this label. And we have all of these organizations that have been built up around this word. However, I've come to realize, again, to kind of state the conclusion of this talk right now, there is no such thing called Parkinson's disease. There's nothing in our brain that anybody can point to and say, that is Parkinson's disease. It's all just a collection of different dysfunctions going wrong that ultimately lead to a wide spectrum of different symptoms. And if anybody's ever had the chance to go to the World Parkinson's Congress, that really made it very clear to me. I remember the first one I went to in Portland in 2016. I walked around the hallways and I was just trying to observe everybody and try to get a sense of what this disease looked like. There were about 1,000 patients that were attending that conference, and I saw what looked like 1,000 different manifestations of this disease. There's 1,000 different flavors of what we call Parkinson's disease. So I start to think, it leads me to think often how useful this term is, because I think words and names in particular have a lot of power over not only individuals, but our society and our minds, and everything about being a human being is defined often by the language that we use and the words that we use to describe the things around us. And it's gotten to the point where we have researchers in labs all around the world studying what they think is Parkinson's disease. They take these mice, they do all sorts of things to them. I can get into that if anybody's curious. But they try to recreate this in a dish or in an animal, and they as if it's one thing, as if it's one biological process that's going on. And unfortunately, the story is much more complex than that. So the problem I saw, and the problem I think we face, is that it seems like medical science will not have a solution in time for me, anyways. I don't know what stage everyone else is at. I don't know what timelines everyone else is going on, but that's the conclusion that I reached after all of my travels. Now, I promise that there's going to be an optimistic twist towards the end of this, so don't worry too much if it sounds very negative right now. But this was kind of the conclusion I reached at some point, that medical science just isn't going to have a solution in time to really help me. Now, the question is why? And this gets back to what I said before. What is Parkinson's? Now, the question of why is kind of it's in many ways the first question we all learn to ask. It's also sometimes a stupid question to ask. I took some philosophy classes in school. Philosophy is built around asking all sorts of big, dumb questions. This was actually on the door of my philosophy departments when I was going to classes. But this question of why comes up again and again and again. So why have we not succeeded in being able to solve this problem? Well, first we have to identify what the problem is. What is it that we're trying to solve? And I'm going to skip through some of these things, but coming back to my roots in philosophy, I leaned on what can we know for sure? What can we say is with absolute certainty is happening in the brains of people with this disease? And unfortunately, when you really dig down deep into it and you ask all the experts out there, nobody is really confident that they know what's going on. Nobody can say for certain what's happening in our brains. A lot of that has to do because this is a very complicated organ and it's a very complicated problem. And there's all sorts of things going wrong simultaneously. But part of it also has to do with some of the assumptions we make. Now, there's another character that I created along the way, a guy named William Shakespeare. And I think he would say this if he were to have Parkinson's. What's in a name? That which we call Parkinson's, but any other name would still suck. And it comes back to this question that I ask again and again and again. Is Parkinson's, what does Parkinson's mean? Is this a useful term? Does it make sense for us to keep calling it this? I mean, it's obviously named after this guy who wasn't even a doctor himself, but he was a very observant fellow, James Parkinson's, over 200 years ago. He walked around and he saw 6 people who had what he termed, what came to be known as Parkinson's disease based on his observations. But what, if anything, does all that mean? And how, more importantly, do we know what we know? How is it that we have identified what we think we know about this disease? It comes back to this, in our models that we build up in our own minds. At the end of the day, The best models we have of anything in the world all exist up here in our domes. This is something I often ask to the researchers and scientists that I come across. In your mind, when you close your eyes at night and you think about what this disease is, what is it that you picture? And I realized at some point that there's kind of a, I don't want to call it a mistake, but there's something flawed about a lot of the ways that we think about our models. So this is the model that I grew up with of the solar system. Now, actually, when I was in school, it also had the 9th planet, Pluto, but regardless, there's something wrong with this model that I was taught. There's something fundamentally flawed that makes it not as it should be. There's something missing that makes it look a little bit, that deceives us, that makes it look like it's this static, nice, orderly system, when in fact it's a little bit different. I'll give you about 20 seconds to think about what do you think is wrong with this model? What do you think is fundamentally flawed? Yes, it's missing the moons and the asteroid belts, but there's 2 other ingredients that are missing from this model. Those 2 things are space and time. To understand anything, you need to know where it is in 3D space, and you have to know what happens to it as it changes over time. And when you add those 2 elements, it really changes how you view things. This is still not exactly correct, but it's a much closer representation to what reality is of what our solar system is really like. We're not just sitting on this planet that is spinning around Earth. We're actually together with the sun, hurtling through space in this kind of elliptical, or I forget what it's called, but there's a name, this chiral, whatever, the spiral-like pattern around the solar system. This applies very closely to what I see in Parkinson's disease, or in what people see. Now, again, a question for everybody out there: how do doctors actually diagnose this disease? What is the definitive diagnosis that's given? How did they know that you had what we call Parkinson's disease? I'll give you a second to think about it, but what's the diagnosis? Well, it's not the UPDRS. It's not anything that we have from images. The only way we can actually officially state whether someone has Parkinson's disease or not is by autopsy. That's the only definitive measure we have right now for Parkinson's. Until we pass away, it's just suspected that we had Parkinson's. The diagnosis only gets confirmed after we've passed away. And most of what our knowledge is that's accumulated over time about this disease comes from the brains of dead people. They open up people's brains after they pass away. They look inside and they see what's there. And based on what's left, they make assumptions about what happened to this person over life. And as you'll see, I like to use humor to kind of soften these blows a little bit. Here's another comic that I really like that kind of points at the same thing. So what I've seen is just a lot of assumptions are being made about what this disease is based on some what I would call shoddy evidence. And I think that's a big part of the reason why we still haven't successfully stopped the course of this disease in anybody. It's also, in many ways, a categorical failure. We have these clusters of diseases. So we have things like Parkinson's, MS, ALS, LBD, schizophrenia, whatever. And we think of them almost as distinct things. Like this person has depression, that other person has Lewy body dementia, this person has Parkinson's and whatnot. But the reality, I think, is something closer to this. Oops. Now you'll see it. They all kind of mesh together. The boundaries between these diseases are not as firm as we'd like them to be. They mesh together. And this starts with the genetics. One classical gene that's been studied a lot is a gene called C9orf72, or something like that. Anyways, doesn't matter. But it's a gene that's commonly associated with what is it? With ALS, I believe. Or yeah, with ALS. But what they found recently is that in the same family of individuals, there's brothers and sisters that carry the same mutation that leads to disease. One would go on to develop Lewy body dementia, the other would go on to develop ALS. So a lot of the things that we think of as being straightforward associated with one disease never fits that cleanly. There's rarely a straight line between anything in biology and what we see in the clinic and what we see in people. Another big problem, another reason for this is the incentives that drive scientists to do what they do. And this is something I spend a lot of time talking with some of the researchers and scientists that I know and arguing on Twitter with them about these things, is the incentives that drive scientists to do what they do. Now, a lot of them, they got into this profession for the best of reasons. They want to help people. They want to try and do what they can to help individuals live a better life. However, along the way, because of the way society is built, frankly, they're not incentivized they don't necessarily have the same goals that we do. And one kind of illustration of this is Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. What is the measure of research? How does a scientist become well-known and famous, and what do they strive for? Well, it's often things that have to do with recognition, like awards or faculty positions. A lot of it, almost all of that really comes down to publications and publication history. They're incentivized primarily to produce research reports. And while this has kind of the knock-on effect of helping people down the road, and it does help us better understand the world around us, and it does push research forward, the benefits that come to the people that they're trying to help are kind of like a secondary effect. It's not the primary goal. It's not what drives them to do their research. Here's a good example of what that does. Ever since the human genome was sequenced 21 years ago, we've started to dig into the genes and we pick the genes apart one by one and we study them in isolation for the most part. What we found lately is that we're producing more and more papers. So the number of papers has steadily gone up, but the amount of genes that we're actually studying is declining. So we're actually studying fewer and fewer genes. And a lot of this has to do with, again, science itself and how science works. I hope you can see this. I'm just going to move something out of the way. But here's, in many ways, what was described to me as what I think now is one of the big fundamental problems that we're facing. Once you've got two or more variables, it becomes incredibly hard to work out what is important. Everything we do is dependent upon solving one variable at a time, which is very inefficient. No one has come up with a better way yet. This is at roots how science works. We try to find one independent variable, we isolate it, we tweak it, we move it up and down, and we see its effects. The problem that we face is I think we're pretty sure that there's more than one thing going wrong inside of us at any given time. This is also why exercise is so important and why exercise is so fruitful. There's a study done at Columbia where they measured how many different molecules in our bloodstream are changed after we are altered in some way after we work out intensely for an hour. They found something like 8,000 different things go up or down as a result of exercise. There's so many different things happening in your body all at once. If you get in a good workout, if you really sweat and you really stretch out your muscles and exercise properly, that it's hard for us to pin down what's actually happening. Now, in many ways, science is just kind of an imperfect tool to study this, because science, like I said, is about trying to find that one variable that is the key. And when scientists often study exercise, they often look for what is the one thing that is changing that I can then turn into a drug that can mimic the effects of exercise. I don't think we'll ever be able to do anything. There will never be a pill that can do for you what exercise can do for you. For that simple reason that there's so much going on in exercise that makes it impossible to actually distill it down into a laboratory. Another big problem we face is just individuals versus population. And I'm going to do something that I probably shouldn't do, but I'm going to quote myself from the book I wrote, Brain Fables. Almost everything we know about this disease comes from studies into groups of people. Those people get plotted as dots on a graph. A line then gets drawn through the middle of the group, reflecting the group's average. That average becomes the result of the study, an average that almost none of the dots falls on. To illustrate that, it looks something like this. This is the end result of a lot of research studies. There's a bunch of different people that get lumped into a study. A line gets drawn through the middle of all the results, and that average becomes the result of the study. And we hope that whatever it spits out applies to as many people as possible in that study. But the reality is that many of us are too far from that line for it to actually be relevant to us. This one I'm going to skip over pretty quickly, but I'll just show you this comic because I like it. There's a lot of hype around machine learning these days, but and it's being applied to biology, and I'm using it myself in some of the research projects that I'm a part of. But just for the sake of time, in this case, I'll skip over this one kind of quickly. So what should we do about this? What can be done at the end of the day? Here comes the more optimistic message. So what needs to be done? Well, first and foremost, everything needs to be centered around the patients. We need more patient-led research. And a great example of this is this guy, Dr. John Stamford. He spent his life studying the biology of Parkinson's disease. He spent 20 years in a laboratory trying to understand what Parkinson's disease is and trying to push forward our understanding of it. He was also, he toured around the world teaching other people about Parkinson's disease, and he was a world-renowned expert. Then he met his first patient. He met his first patient in the mirror. He was diagnosed himself with the disease, but funny enough, he didn't know, he wasn't able to diagnose himself. He needed a neurologist to point it out to him. He's since become a pretty well-known advocate for this disease, and he has this to say about his time as a scientist. Patients have to lead the agenda and be able to say to scientists, these are my priorities and these are the things that need addressing. The idea of scientists alone making the decisions about what they perceive to be Parkinson's is insane. If I think back to who I was before the diagnosis, I wouldn't trust myself to make those decisions. I spend a lot of time giving talks to scientists and to researchers, and I try to hammer this message home as often as I can. I can't tell you how many, I've lost track of how many labs, how many biotech companies, how many academic centers I've been to where I was the first patient to ever even walk through their doors, let alone interact with them or give talks to them. It's something that I think we need a lot more of. We need a lot more people reaching out, looking for research, looking for patients to actively lead their programs and to take part in the design of their research studies, not just to be, for lack of a better term, guinea pigs in their clinical trials, but we need patients to really be at the forefront of pushing researchers to work for us, frankly. At the moment, they're, like I said, they're incentivized to do things that aren't necessarily in our best interests. And yet, all of our funding goes, or the vast majority of funding for Parkinson's disease goes to the basic researchers, goes to the basic scientists. That's where most of our funding goes to. That's where most of our hope, frankly, lies. However, we have to make sure it's being steered in the right direction. And to illustrate that point again, here's basically how research works. Now, this is a vast oversimplification of a much more complicated process, but this is the bare bones of it. An observation is made in the clinic. It gets written down in a research report. A basic scientist picks up on that and tries to find that one variable that they can tweak so that they can turn it into a paper. Then funding bodies come along, they read all the research, or they hear talks from the scientists, and they decide which research is most worthy of being pursued. Then industry comes along, picks it up and gets it through the clinical trial process so that it can become, so that it can get passed by regulators and become a drug or a therapy. Now, something fundamental is missing from this process, and that is the patient. And when you add patients to the process, it brings color to the whole system. So this is more or less how I think it should be. Sorry for the depiction of patients as an ambulance, but it's just the bias that Microsoft has. Patients should be part of every part of this, every step in this process should be centered around the patient. Ideally, I would almost like for patients to be, or what I sometimes say to some research labs that I go and visit and talk to, is rather than trying to solve this problem that we call Parkinson's disease, start with just one patient. Bring one patient in and see what you can do for them. If you can try to cure one individual before you can try to cure all 7 million people living with this disease. I think that if we really centered our focus and centered our approach around the individual patient, it would go a long way towards accelerating what we're trying to do here. And our ultimate goal, of which is trying to find better therapies and ultimately trying to cure this disease. Now, how do we change the incentive system? How do we actually realign in society so that we can build a more patient-centered healthcare system? Well, there is no easy solution. There is no quick fix. There is no, I can't snap my fingers and make this happen. I have some ideas, and I'll share some of them in a moment with all of you, but I think this is the question that we need to be thinking about. How do we get the system to work more for us? And how can we better align everyone's incentives so that the needs of the patients are better taken care of and are at the forefront of everyone's thinking? I'm lucky in a sense because here in Toronto, I think we have some great neurologists, some great scientists that really take this to heart. Recently, we've started to develop an interdisciplinary clinic here, thanks with the team at the University of Toronto. And we're starting to bring patients in. We set up a patient advisory board, and we have patients playing a very active role in the clinic and in some of the research that gets done here. But this needs to become a more global effort. How to do this? Well, the ideas that I have here get a little bit wacky, and it takes us into some extreme directions. But I always like to think, to guide my efforts and to guide my thinking about the best of all possible worlds. In an ideal, I'm an idealist at heart. And in an ideal world, what would a perfect healthcare system look like? And how can we design our system so that we can come closer to that perfect world? Now, again, I'm not going to spend my time, I'm not going to tell you, I have some slides about my ideas for how to do this. I'm not going to get into the details of that because it just bogs everything down. And it's a whole other talk in and of itself. But I think this is the question that we need to be asking ourselves. Not so much and this is the question that I ask scientists and researchers all the time. And if anyone has any suggestions for how to better hammer home this message, I'm more than happy to hear them. But I think primarily what needs to be done is that the thinking needs to be switched from most research happens in these 3-year time windows. Most grants from the government or from funding agencies last for 3 years, and they're limited in what they can do in those 3 years. They're limited in the scope of the questions that they can ask. What we need to be asking instead is what needs to be done to solve the problem we have. Not so much what can we do with the time and the resources available to us, but what needs to be done to fundamentally solve the problem. And like I said, I have my own ideas that involve blockchains and all sorts of other crazy things. And I'm happy to go into this if anybody wants me to dig into this a little bit more. But this is just my vision for the system. I have no idea if this is the right way to do this. I have no idea if this is the optimal way to design our systems. This is just where my head has been going lately. This is where my thinking has been leading towards. But I think that we should be actively getting more people to think about that idea, think about that grand challenge of how to design our healthcare systems in such a way that it's centered more around the patient and that it empowers the patient to make decisions about not only their own healthcare, but the direction of research. And blah, 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 blah. Cryptocurrencies, tokens, all these kinds of things are part of it. Here's parts of what it would look like. But yeah, the next element, and this is really the last part of the talk that I'll give, and then I'll open the floor to questions if anyone has any, is the hunt for biomarkers. At the end of the day, we need some kind of biological signal that we can point to that can tell us more about this disease than any doctor or scientist ever could, or any doctor or clinician ever could at this point. So it all starts with trying to find a good signal, a good biomarker for whatever's going wrong with us. There's a lot of attempts being made to find these biomarkers. There's the PPMI study, there's studies going on in different parts around the world. But I think there's a fundamental problem with a lot of them, and that is how they classify people. So they lump everyone together with this disease called Parkinson's. Then they break them up into smaller clusters like tremor dominant or postural instability dominant. And then they try to find what's different about those groups. I think the equation kind of has to be turned on its head. We need to start from the biology and then work up to what we see in the clinic. And I'm part of a program that's doing exactly that. So the program that we designed, that was redesigned by the co-author of the book I wrote, Dr. Alberto Espe at the University of Cincinnati, is doing this. He's bringing together 2,000 patients with Parkinson's disease, with any form of Parkinson's disease, 2,000 patients with any form of dementia, 1,000 healthy controls, and he's then stripping them of their diagnostic label. So so they're collecting all sorts of samples from them and removing the diagnostic label from the individual. Then he's turning it over to the bioanalytics people, churning all that omics data, churning all that biological information, and letting the biology sort the clusters themselves rather than us pre-deciding which clusters we should be looking for signals in. Now, it's a little bit complicated. There's a lot of complexity to this. But essentially what it'll boil down to is this, is finding what's right for each individual person. The question is, and the question that sometimes keeps me up at night, is how many different diseases are we talking about? How many different solutions are we going to need to come up with to one day be able to actually effectively manage and tackle this thing we call Parkinson's? But at the end of the day, like I said, this is what's needed. We need to be thinking about how to tailor our approaches to individuals. Just looking around at this chat room here, I see all sorts of different phenotypes, what's called, all sorts of different ways that this disease expresses itself. I'm pretty sure that what works for me is not going to work for most of the other people in this room. We very much need tailored solutions to the problems that we face. And there's all sorts of ways that people are going about that. But like I said, for my money and where I've put my eggs is here, the CCBP, the Cincinnati Cohort Biomarker Program. It's still a relatively young study. We're about a year and a half into it, but our recruitment numbers are going up steadily and we're starting to see some good things happen as a result. But it's very much a long-term vision. It's going to take some time for us to realize everything that we're doing. If anybody wants to learn more, you can go to, ccbpstudy.com and there's all the information, or feel free to reach out to me afterwards if you have any questions, or if there are any questions that come up during the question and answer period, I'd be happy to answer them. But yeah, this is the program that I think, like I said, I traveled around the world looking for what I thought was the best approach to tackling this disease long-term. Who had what I thought was the best strategy going forward. And I found that in Alberto Espe and in people at the University of Cincinnati. And together we wrote this book, Brain Fables, which is now available anywhere you find books. And in it, we discuss our own journeys and the reasons for why we think this biomarker program in Cincinnati is the way that we should be going in the future. But with that, I'll say thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, if there's any things that come up, that I'd be happy to take them. If anything comes up later, feel free to write down my email address or my Twitter handle. Feel free to reach out to me by any means that you want. I'm always happy to get questions and to answer as many of them as I can. But yeah, thank you for taking the time to listen. And now I'll open it up to any questions anyone might have. And with that, I'll stop sharing the screen as well.
And this is Jim. Can you hear?
Yes, I hear you, Jim.
You're wearing a black ring on your one thumb on one hand and the index finger on the other hand. Does that have anything to do with Parkinson's?
Yeah, so this is a sensory ring. It's kind of sharp. It hurts a little bit when I put it on. But I found, I don't know if anybody else has this experience, and I'd love to hear anybody else's stories, but I found that if I have this kind of ring on, it helps, for some reason, give sensory feedback from my hand all the way up to my brain. It kind of helps me locate my hand in space a little bit better. And for whatever reason, it might dampen my proprioceptive pathways. But for whatever it does, it helps alleviate the tremor a little bit. It's not perfect. There's no perfect solutions, but it does help me a little bit. And I have all sorts of things like that around me, these stringy things as well. All sorts of little things.
Some of us hit objects as they're walking through a room, like door jams and things. Does that have anything to do with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Or like drawing lines on the floor obviously helps as well. There's all sorts of little tricks you pick up along the way about what helps you just kind of navigate the space around you a little bit better.
I didn't mean to ask the off-the-wall question, but I was absolutely curious to see what your answer was going to be. Thank you.
No, I love those kinds of questions. Feel free to ask any crazy question anybody wants.
How old are you now?
I'm 36. We'll be 37 in August.
Are you taking medication?
Yep, I take levodopa, carbidopa, amantadine, and pramipexole.
Did you start right away or did you put it off?
I waited about 2 years before I started.
Are you familiar with the Apple Watch?
Yes, I am.
It's for collecting data related to Parkinson's?
Yeah, I found it to be kind of useful. I used it for a period of time. There's a new watch that I'm looking forward to trying soon called I want to say KGB, but that's not right. KL something or other. Yeah, it's all those self-tracking devices. They can be useful, but they can also be a bother. Also, I just have trouble wearing something on my wrist. It's not comfortable for me, so it's not a great solution for me. Let's see.
I was wondering how you got access to all of these places that you visited. You didn't just knock on the door and walk in.
I guess the long and short of it is I became a nuisance to some of them. So I was constantly asking questions, constantly sending emails at the beginning, until the point where they just kind of gave in and said, okay, let's let this kid run around and see and ask his questions. But no, the reality is I just met a lot of nice people along the way. My first visit was at a lab in San Diego. I went down at the invitation of the head of the lab there. I started by just writing her an email, explaining my story, explaining that I was interested in what they were doing. And I guess that was a big key to it, is taking a real interest in the work that they're doing, because a lot of them are working on some fascinating things. I mean, some of the things happening in labs around the world right now is really crazy. The things that biology will enable us to do in this century is mind-blowing in so many different ways. Whether it be gene editing technologies, or I have a good friend who's at the NIH who's growing little mini brains in a lab there. In a dish, basically, they're growing like little miniature human brains. Yeah, and if anybody wants, I'll be on a talk with her in about a week and a half with the PEMD Alliance. But yeah, there's all sorts of just cool and interesting experiments going on. And I find that scientists, if you take an interest in their work and you show like a genuine passion for what they're doing, they'll let you do whatever you want with them.
Do you have a regime for exercising?
I should have one. I don't stick to it as well as I should, but I do have a trainer that I work out with at least 3 times a week over Zoom. I bought a spin bike and a rowing machine so I could get as much exercise as I could at my home. But I don't have any great routine that I stick to. I kind of just exercise when I feel like. Thankfully, I do manage to try to get in at least 1 exercise session a day, but often it's not vigorous enough. You can never do enough. But yeah, I do. Yeah, I wouldn't say I stick to a routine. I kind of just try to listen to my body and try to do whatever my body needs from moment to moment.
Prior to your diagnosis, did you have a regime, or is it the same?
No, I was traveling a lot prior to my diagnosis, so I didn't really have the opportunity to have a regime.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I totally agree with you with a lot of what you've said. Having been a researcher myself, psychological researcher, I totally agree with what you're saying. The pitfalls and the limitations and the difficulties and the variable issue. I'm interested in I agree with you about patient-centered, patient-driven research. So besides being on advisory boards, what else can we do, people with Parkinson's do, to enhance the direction of research?
Well, I would suggest try to make connections with local research labs. I don't know where you are, but in the Bay Area, there's a ton of different great research labs, a lot of great biotech companies as well. If anybody wants help getting access to some of them, I've visited a number of them in the Bay Area. There's a lot of great research going on there, but I think that when they see that there's patients knocking on the door, asking them questions, it does have an impact. It influences how they do things. Even if it's not an overt impact, it does have an effect. So I would just say try to make connections with local researchers, and a lot of them are looking for patients to either be on advisory boards. They just don't have the connections. They don't know where to find patients. They don't know where to look often. So just doing what we can to bridge as many of those gaps as possible.
And do
Yeah.
you have any thoughts about the correlation between Faircloth and Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, the book Ending Parkinson's caused a big stir about that. I think there's definitely something there. I don't know how much. There's definitely something to be said about it. I don't think it's the pesticide that I would use. I don't think it's one that probably should be used. But I can't speak to in detail about it, I guess. But it doesn't explain this disease. I'll say that much. It's a factor in some people's disease, that's for sure. But yeah, it's just one of many things that we need to do.
Have you thought about doing DDI surgery for your tremor?
Sorry?
Have you thought about doing DDI surgery for your tremor?
DBI, what's DBI?
Deep brain stimulation. DDI.
Oh, yes. Yes, I'm actually today I just got sent to me a protocol for a new trial that I'm considering joining for adaptive deep brain simulator.
Jerry, quickly, I got a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, Gerald.
Oh, good. One thing I notice about the group in this particular group is that by exercising, we seem to be happier, quite a bit happier, actually. And I noticed myself when I'm really bummed out and I can't get out of bed, whatever, if I drag myself out and get on the walkways around here and march around for an hour or so, I just get happier. And that's why I wrote down nuns and Lewy bodies. That was one of these autopsy things. They did autopsy on nuns, and they found that they had fewer physiological markers, I guess you'd call them, that they'd look for in Parkinson's disease or any maybe other ones too. Have you run into anything like that? Because you were sort of looking at how to look at physical conditions, but how about the quality of life and how that relates to your survivability?
Yeah, it's definitely an important issue. And happier people, I mean, they live better lives regardless if they have disease or don't have a disease. I mean, it's hard to say what role it plays in one's progression, but I can only imagine that if you are content with your life, if you're happy, if you're not depressed, if you're staying active, and if you're staying socially connected to people around you, it can only have a positive effect.
Thank you.
Question.
Yes, John.
Well, since it sounds like there's not going to be any fix during the rest of our lifetimes, are there any nutrients or antioxidants or any like glutathione, alpha lipoic acid, or anything of that nature that you think would be helpful? Or that you take yourself? Sorry.
Well, first, I don't want to say that there's not going to be any breakthroughs. I think there are going to be some, especially in the next few years to come, but they're only going to be for select individuals. They're not going to be for everybody. They're going to be for people that have specific markers. And there's some in particular that I'm looking forward to, especially if anyone here has a GBA mutation. There's some exciting things in the pipeline.
A stem cell?
And maybe the stem cell therapies will bear fruit as well. But there are some breakthroughs that are going to be happening over the next 5 to 10 years that should make an impact on a lot of people's lives. That said, for most people, the best we'll have is exercise, a healthy lifestyle. And then as far as nutrients and supplements go, there are things that help some people, but like everything else, it has to be tailored to the individual. It's hard to make any general recommendations for all people with Parkinson's disease, because like I said, we all have something different. We're all dealing with something slightly unique. I, for myself, take some fish oil and some vitamin D supplements just to make sure that I have enough of those. But unfortunately, it's all about tailoring it to, or figuring out for ourselves what's best for us. Ideally, you'd want to consult with a nutritionist, consult with a doctor, get them to run a full blood panel on you, make sure that you have like your B12 levels are all okay, make sure you're in the healthy range, and if anything is deficient, definitely fix that.
Thank you.
Correct.
Could you identify what your idea of a healthy lifestyle is? What is it for you in particular?
That's a good question. I guess, well, primarily it would be coming back to what was said before, doing things that make you happy. Being able to wake up each day and do the things that you want to do. And now that's very difficult. It's easy to say, it's very difficult to actually do. There's all sorts of things in our lives that bring us anxiety and stress and that can make us depressed. Doing whatever is needed to make sure that you, I don't want to say get rid of those things. You can never get rid of it, stress or anxiety altogether. You have to be able to learn how to live with it to some degree. But doing what you can to limit them, to make sure that they don't take up your life, make sure that they don't drive your decisions, and to make sure that they're not, that they don't become recurring parts of your life. That if something is coming up that brings you stress and anxiety, that you deal with it head on, and that you then find a way to move on to the next thing that you want to deal with. Don't dwell on any one thing for too long. I saw somebody ask where to get the ring from. Amazon. I think they're called sensory rings. There's like these sensory packets that are for autistic children. I bought one of them for like $20 or $30. They come with all sorts of little balls and toys and gadgets. Some of them are useless. Some of them are useful. Just playing with them and figuring out what works for you.
Benjamin,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Paul, and I'd like to share a little bit, if I can do it quickly, about my situation. I was diagnosed in late 2014, which means I probably had it a couple of years before that. I'm 71 years old now, and I've learned a few things, I think, over those years. Many of them having to do with, thanks to Lisa and Steph. But about 3 years ago, I woke up with a premonition one morning that I could take my basketball and go on my patio and dribble it backwards, forwards, turn around and do all that stuff. And I did it. And about 2 weeks after that, I said, if I can bounce a basketball, I can play tennis again. So my younger son, who's 32, is an excellent tennis player and a great teacher. So I've been playing tennis with him for 3 years, at least once a week. And what I realized my balance has gotten better over time. And believe me, I'm not trying to brag here, but I'm trying to say sort of the spectrum and some of the things I've learned quickly here. And when we would have drumming classes, I found that I could do 360s just by throwing my arms around. And I realized after a while, you dummy, here's why you can do all those things, because you took 5 years of figure skating lessons in my 30s. Now, the point there is everybody can't go out and take figure skating lessons in their 30s. It's not probably the primary way to get good exercise. I do exercise every day. I'm trying to cut out sugar entirely. I believe firmly that what you said, exercise and a healthy lifestyle can have many, many benefits, because I feel like I think I pay a lot of, I give many thanks for the exercise and Lisa and Steph. And so I don't know if I'm at the end of one spectrum or not, but I may demonstrate that everybody is totally independent. The last comment I'll make is I didn't like the number of times I was falling. So I worked out a way to go up and down stairs, cut out 90% of my falling, which has helped me a lot too. So that's a long story. And I don't mean, again, I'm not trying to brag, and I'm just trying to demonstrate one person's story. And I have had DBS, by the way, and I don't notice that it's done a whole lot for me.
Okay, well, I would say you should brag. Any success stories are worth sharing, however small, however personal or slight they might be. And actually, it's funny that you mentioned basketball, because I'm going to show a quick video now, if I can, if we have the time. It's just going to take about a minute.
Great.
But I wonder if your experience is similar to what I experienced here. Can everybody see this? This was my basketball experience. It's just a minute long. So this was me without medication, trying to walk a little bit. This was in Cincinnati with one of the neurologists that I was working with there. But then
you make the shot?
Yeah, so that was my experience. Was yours something similar to that, Paul?
Actually, yes, it does. When I started playing tennis with my son, I'm I'm a different person than when I'm not playing tennis with my son. I have to limit it. I've paid very much attention to when enough is enough. My body tells me when to stop. I don't go out in hot weather like we're having today. I do some things to be very careful, but I've experienced exactly the same thing as you do. When you do something like that, you become somewhat of a different person.
Yeah, I agree completely. I have exactly the same feeling. So even though we might have something slightly different, there's definitely something in common with what you got and what I got.
Hmm.
You guys
Thank
have
you.
any other questions or any other comments or things you'd like to share? Now's the time, guys. We still have them here. A couple minutes.
I just want to thank you for being so transparent and sharing your story. It's encouraging and inspiring. And I agree with your philosophy, and that we have to treat, we all are different, and we have to treat, I don't know if it's a symptom or whether it's what's something, and I can't articulate it. I'm blaming it on PD. My throat's like freezing up.
Yeah, I agree completely, Sandy. We're each our own special snowflake in a way. And we each deserve and should demand the individual attention that we need.
Yes.
I'd like to weigh in. Again, Ben, thanks so much. Benjamin, thank you for your comments. And everybody else here, Paul, I mean, that's a great story. I'm newly diagnosed, 3 months in, very active lifestyle, former marathon runner, active cyclist, do yoga every day. And I haven't slowed down a bit, and I'm just like, I'm determined that I'm going to fight back by just staying super active. But if you have any general comments just about what you've seen or observed in the way of progression, related to newly diagnosed Parkinson's, and it's probably everyone's different, but just if there's any sort of, that's the scariest thing for me at this point is what's coming down ahead of me, what might happen. And so just, I'm sure keep doing what I'm supposed to be doing, but any other thoughts you have would be helpful.
Yeah, it's tough because everyone walks their own path, everyone lives their own life. But the first year or two after my diagnosis, it was kind of similar. Like I didn't feel a progression. I didn't feel anything was really getting that worse. At some point, I guess one other point that I'm making, this comes back to, I forget who said it, but one thing that can get in the ways of any, and this is kind of an impossible thing to ask, but try to avoid anything that would bring about too much trauma or any very traumatic events. Now, again, that's kind of a stupid thing to say. How can you avoid those entirely? But you'll often find in people's stories that they start to get worse at certain events in their life, like certain traumatic events in particular can have a very bad impact. So as was said before, do what you can to continue living as happy a life as you can. Be active, do what you enjoy, have as much fun as you can with life.
Let me say this. My attitude is every step I take in an exercise or walking, jogging slowly or whatever, riding my bicycle, everything I do, I think of myself literally physically as fighting back. I'm fighting back against Parkinson's. And that and the diet, the exercise, but having something in your life that's fun. You got to have fun. Something that you enjoy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just fight back every day. I just say, I'm doing this exercise, and every step I take it's a step. It's another step.
I would just add one thing to that, which is that I think you should not let the disease define you. Don't let the disease define you. Continue with your life, do the things to reinforce you positively, and don't let the disease define your every movement.
Yeah, it's one thing that you have to deal with, but everybody in life has something that they're dealing with. And that's something that I learned is that even though I have Parkinson's and I'm dealing with the symptoms that I experience, I've noticed that the people around me are all dealing with something of themselves as well. It's just another thing that comes up in some people in life, and you got to find a way to live with it, but don't, as Robert said, don't let it be who you are, because it isn't who you are.
Thanks a lot.
Ben, this is Adam. I have a couple of questions. One is you're obviously doing a ton of stuff and a lot of work. And I wonder, do you get fatigued in any given day? Like, what is just, doing all this desk work and thought, it is taxing. And, as another, I was diagnosed at 49 and I'm 52. And that's been one of the rougher things, is just running out of energy. And then in terms of devices, the timing for DBS for someone with YOPD seems to be a really tough question, just because there could be advances at any time. And then since you're in Toronto, do you have any thoughts on the PONS device, which I believe is being kind of originated out there, or maybe Norman Dodge was talking about it a couple of years ago?
Yeah, for the first question, fatigue. So I don't find myself, so lately in particular, I found ways that I could sleep much better than I used to. And I found that I get very fatigued when I'm not sleeping properly. And I guess that would be in many ways the number one issue I think that people should try to focus on, is doing whatever needs to be done to making sure that you sleep for as good as you possibly can. It fixes so many other issues when you can sleep properly at night. So if you have to see a sleep doctor to get treatment for something or other, or if you have to take something to help you sleep a little better, do whatever needs to be done. As regards to your question about PONS, or I don't know if your next question was PONS, but anyways, I can't say much about what Norman Deutsch's work. His books are entertaining. He's a great storyteller, but he's not a Parkinson's specialist. I've heard a lot of people questioning some of the conclusions that he reached about Parkinson's, but I can't speak too much to it. And your DBS question. Yeah, with that one, you need a good specialist, somebody who you can trust, somebody who is working in your best interest. Because it is, like you said, it's kind of a difficult tightrope to walk, because there are new things coming in the pipeline. There's new developments happening all the time. You just have to be able to work with your doctor and figure out when is best for you.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about PONS? Is it because you don't necessarily support it, or you have not done research on it?
I haven't done research on it.
Okay, so it's still like a possibility of something that could be.
Yeah.
Possible.
In general, I found with any anecdote that I come across, like I always hear story that not a week goes by that I don't hear a story about something that works for Parkinson's. And the reality is that it probably works for somebody with Parkinson's.
Right.
But figuring out who that is, and this whole thing is all about trial and error. And at the end of the day, we're our own experiments, we're our own best teachers, we're our own scientists, we're our own physicians as well. If you're not satisfied with the care that you're getting, experiment with something new, try something new, whether it be PONS or stimulation mats or infrared saunas or whatever it might be. There's 1,001 things you can try. Something will help you get through the day a little bit better.
Hi, this is Sonia. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about swimming and Parkinson's? I learned to swim when I was really young, and I swim my whole life, but I can't swim anymore. I just seem to sink.
That's unfortunate. For me, it's been a great tool. I love getting in the pool, and for whatever reason, when I splash down in the pool, my Parkinson's goes away, even if it's just momentarily. That feeling of being in the water really helps me, but it's not for everybody. Like I said, everybody has their own strain, their own flavor. If it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. That's not to say it can't work for you. There might be something you can do to help. Maybe get one of those kick boards. You can just hold on to something and kick in the water. Or if you have, if I had to, I would even get a life set. What's it called? Some kind of flotation device, just to help you swim again. Because I love being in the water. So
I love it too. It really bothers me that I have to really watch it. I get.
I'm not.
I went underwater once and I was all turned around, was disoriented, and my head was going down instead of up. So I've been afraid to get anything very deep.
Well, first and foremost, stay safe. Don't do anything too risky out there.
Yeah, right. Thanks.
Yeah.
I would strongly urge you to look into the flotation devices, because when I one day found out I was sinking in the water, I got several kinds of flotation devices. Some are very modest, and they just have a belt with individual flotation things. Some are jackets, but I think I quit swimming for other reasons. But if you really want to swim, there are flotation devices that would keep you up on shore, because they worked for me. I mean, that's a stupid thing to say, but if it's simply that you sink when you don't use a flotation device, try it before you give up on that.
Thank you so much, Ben. We really appreciate you sharing your story, being so real and honest. Thank you for doing all the research that you do. We appreciate that. And we thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, make sure you guys, this book here, I put it into our newsletter, The Brain Fables. It's fascinating. It's a nice short read, lots of detail, and just really opens your mind to think in a different way. It's always just questioning, which I think is really good for the brain too, right? The brain likes new things, it wants to learn. And my take home message is really that we are our own snowflake. Like, everybody is different. And that's a beautiful image to keep in mind as we go through this together. And thanks, Ben, for, really just opening up our minds and our views on this.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, feel free to share my contact information with anybody who might want. I'm happy to take any questions, or if anyone needs any. I also just want to say, I guess, that I can't, you know more about your Parkinson's than anyone else could. I can help you with what I can, but at the end of the day, listen to yourselves as well. I think a lot of you know what's best for yourselves. I also have a hard time following my heart sometimes and following my inner voice telling me what I should be doing and what I shouldn't be doing. But there's a lot of wisdom in our brains, even if parts of it aren't working as well as they should be. There's a whole lot in there that's still going right and still working as it should.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great advice. And I was just going to say, we'd love to have you back to talk more about blockchain and cryptocurrency. We love it.
Get all geeked out.
We get all geeked out with you. So thank you so much. Yeah, you guys do what you love. And, Ben, if you are ever bored and want to pop into class, we'd love to have you. We're on 6 days a week. So
are you a math teacher by any chance?
No, he's not a math teacher.
I'm not a math teacher.
Lisa's been looking for a math teacher for a long time. She's always looking for a physics teacher, a math teacher in our classes. To be in our classes. Right. Anyway, but thank you so much for spending this time with us. And we know we took you over, so thank you so much.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me. This was a joy, and yeah, I'm happy to be back anytime, whether it be blockchains or whatever.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna
Thank you.